processing meat, we're more like this. The problem is we can't metabolize protein very well. We can tolerate some of it, we need it in our diet. But if we get too much of it, we get sick. And the reason we know is that about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, a bunch of Scandinavian explorers went to the Canadian Arctic. And they got there, they wanted to map the place, they wanted to check the place out, you know, name islands after themselves, that sort of thing. And when they got there, there's all these wild Arctic hares running around. And they thought, oh, this is great, we don't even need to bring food. We can just eat all these wild Arctic hares. And that's what they did. Only the funny thing is they started to eat them, they were pretty lean. And they would eat some wild Arctic hare, and it wasn't enough. So they started to eat more. And they kept eating more and more of this lean hare meat, and they just couldn't get satisfied. They were eating so much of it that they looked pregnant, that you could actually see the bulge in their stomach beneath their billowy Arctic clothing. They would get these horrible headaches, their breath would start to stink, they would get confused, and all they would talk about is a constant craving for fat. And eventually they died. It's called rabbit starvation. And probably the most interesting thing about humans as hunters is that we can't prey on the sick and the weak the way a real carnivore can. We have to go for the fattest, primest members of the herd. To do that, you got to be a really good hunter. And I think that's where that big brain comes back in. So if we consistently get something like over 60% of our dietary energy from protein, we will simply die. We can't make it. So we need fat. We love fat. We always think of fat being flavor. Only this is wrong. We love fat, but fat isn't flavor. And this is the central tension in why we get beef wrong, why things have gotten wrong. It's probably what this guy up here thought, but the myth was perpetuated. It has been perpetuated and continues to be perpetuated. If you turn on the Food Network, you don't have to watch for about more than 5 minutes before some guy says, fat is flavor. You want to get the fat in there, fat is flavor. It's not. And one of the reasons this myth is being perpetuated, one of the prime people you can blame, is the government. I'll tell you why. In 1926, the USDA created its grading standards. Before then, there was no official grading standards. The meat packers had their own standards, but there was nothing that the government was not involved. But in 1926, the situation got to the point where people thought, someone needs to do something. We have a beef quality problem. And the reason is that the beef system industrialized. If you go back about 50 years earlier, there was a direct relationship between the people who produced beef and the people who bought it and sold it, the butchers, the restaurants. There would be these huge cattle drives all the way from parts of Texas. They would go right up to New York City. They would slowly graze. People think of cattle drives as a stampede. They were very slow. They were grazing the cattle to market. And then they would get there, and the people that sold it could see the cattle that they were buying. But then the railroad system happened. And the railroads were a good thing. I'm not against progress. But the railroads caused a problem because now we started processing beef in centers. We would take the cattle to a particular place, like the Kansas City stockyards or the Chicago stockyards. We'd process them there. They got really good at it. In fact, Henry Ford got the idea for the assembly line only after seeing the disassembly line at the Chicago stockyards. But the problem is, beef was coming from everywhere. So you might be a restaurant in New York City who would order a whole ribeye, and it might come from a great Hereford that was fattened on, let's say, the Flint Hills in Kansas. Or you might get a plate-out dairy heifer, not a heifer, dairy cow. Quality problem. So everyone said the government has got to step in and do something. The government had already been grading grain and grading fruit, so they said, well, why don't we grade beef? Why don't we try and figure it out so that people can have some idea, some way of knowing what quality of beef they're getting, so that they don't get ripped off. An important thing, so what did the government do? The government did exactly what those cave people did. They looked for fat. They weren't looking for marbling. They were looking for fat on the body. They had words for it like feathering and frosting. And the cattle that weren't too old, that had the most fat, got the highest grade. They were graded prime. And this beef sold for the highest price. Prime. Well, what happened after that really isn't surprising. The government put the message out there, we'll pay more for fat cattle that aren't too old, and industry said, fine, you want fat cattle? We'll give you fat cattle. And that's what they did. They acted in a rational way. Industry acted exactly as you'd expect them to. They figured out a way to produce fatter and fatter cattle for a cheaper and cheaper price. One thing we did is we started feeding cattle a lot more grain. In the 1930s, the USDA reported that about 6% of cattle were coming off feed. That's obviously gotten a lot higher. But that's just a very small part of it. I think the things that really made a difference were the use of things like hormones and antibiotics to get cattle to get bigger, even faster, More recently, we've been using beta agonists, and the results have been pretty stunning. In the 1950s, a steer coming off a USDA feed, not a USDA, a steer coming off a feedlot was around 24 to 26 months of age. Now it's more like 14 months. It's creeping up a bit lately because the cost of grain is getting higher. But that's a remarkable improvement in efficiency. We started using continental stock to get framier cattle. They put on weight even faster. So it's pretty remarkable what we've achieved. We've made cattle far more efficient. Beef is a lot more inexpensive. Beef is way cheaper. These things all sound like good things, but there's a problem. And the problem is the problem that struck me when I started out on this journey, and that is flavor. We have lost flavor. And the reason is that fat isn't flavor. So the question is, where does flavor come from in beef if it isn't fat? And by the way, if anyone's skeptical as to whether or not fat is flavor, I would love you to do an experiment. Go home, pour yourself a tablespoonful of canola oil or vegetable oil, corn oil, whatever you got, and taste it and tell me how much flavor it has. Do the same thing with lard. What you're going to find is it has mouthfeel, it has moisture, it has kind of a bigness in your mouth, but there is no flavor, there's no character. So where does it come from? Well, some of it is in the properties that make beef beef in the flesh. The flavor industry would call these processed flavors. When you cook a steak, you create something called a Maillard reaction. That's the browning that you see. And this creates some of the really pleasurable roasty qualities. Now, you can get a Maillard reaction in a really crappy, cheap USDA Select feedlot steak, and you can get it in that, whatever, I can't, 500 bucks, like 100 grams, I think that's what I saw. No, it wasn't that much. But you can get it in great Wagyu beef as well, the Maillard reaction. This is something common to all beef. So the question is, where does that character come from? Where does the flavor come from that makes beef distinctive, that kind of punches you in the face with that wow, that oh my God, that tastes amazing? That was the question that I had. And it took me a long time to realize that that was the question that I was trying to answer. Well, I had three interesting clues. There's been three interesting clues to me along this journey. The first was in Argentina. Argentina is famous for its pampas. We talk an awful lot about that, but the truth is Argentina's beef system has been in a sad state of disarray, mainly due to really irresponsible government policy. And one thing Argentina's been doing is putting up really big Texas-style feedlots. And I met with a man named Miguel de Achabal, who works for a company you guys may have heard of called Cactus Feeders. They have now gotten involved in the feeding industry in Argentina. And we sat down and had an interesting interview. And I said, how's it going? What have you learned? And he said, well, one of the first things they learned, what they started out doing, is they started taking weaned steers and putting them right into the feed yard. And I said, oh, how did that work out? He said, oh, it was terrible. I said, why? And he said, because the beef tasted like pork. And I thought, what? It tasted like pork? I always thought that the reason animals tasted the way they were was because of their character, their DNA. But he said, no, if you put a cattle right into the feed yard, straight off a weaning, it's going to taste like pork. Well, that was interesting. Another interesting experience I had was I went to judge a steak contest in South Africa. And there was a steak there that I encountered that looked perfect. It was a Wagyu, a full-blood Wagyu steak. Gorgeously marbled, almost tender enough to cut it with a fork, incredibly juicy, and just a total zero in the flavor department. It had absolutely nothing. I was stunned, because I'm a huge fan of Wagyu beef, and I thought, what's going on with this? So I asked him a little bit about how he did it, and he finishes his cattle probably in a very similar manner to a lot of you in here. Does it low and slow, not too hot of a ration. And then he told me this. I said, well, what do you use for your roughage? And he said, I use straw. And I thought, that's interesting. Well, then the third clue on this journey was that at a certain point I got very interested in the question of nutrition and how the fatty acid profile of beef impacts human health, because there's a lot of concern about that. So I called my alma mater, the University of Toronto. I contacted their nutrition department, and they put me in touch with a guy there who's a lipid expert. All he does is live and breathe fats all day. He studies fats in the brain, he studies fats in the blood. He's a lipid guy. He also happens to be a wine lover and a food lover, so we became great friends. We play squash twice a week. And he told me he would run some fatty acid profiles for me. So I gave him 4 samples. One of them was just standard Ontario commodity beef, corn-fed beef, probably 14 months old, the stuff you buy at the supermarket. The 3 others were from older cattle that had eaten way more grass. And before he ran the profile, he phoned me up and he said, you're not going to believe what happened. He extracted the fat. He used these chemicals to extract all the fat from the beef, which he was then going to analyze. And he said the craziest thing happened. 3 of the samples are just these wild colors. And here's what they look like. Notice, I don't know if you can read the letters B, C, and D. Those all came from the cattle that ate more grass. A was from the commodity one, and it looks like lard. It just looks totally clear. It kind of looks empty. B looks like apple juice, C looks like tea, and D looks kind of like scotch. The interesting thing is that to some degree the color of those samples matches the flavor. The most flavorful of those steaks was C. It just had this really deep, rich, very slightly gamey flavor. And it was also the darkest one. So it was almost like we were seeing flavor. And I said to him, what are we looking at there? What is that? What's causing that color? And he said it's plant compounds. What you're seeing there are things like carotenoids. Those are the things that make carrots orange. They're the things that make a chicken orange when the chicken's been outside eating grass and stuff like that. You're seeing terpenoids. These are the class of chemicals that make rosemary taste like rosemary and oregano taste like oregano. And that was getting in the beef. So you can't see it when you look at the fat. Because the one thing we forget about, we talk an awful lot about trim fat, we talk an awful lot about marbling, but there's fat in beef that you can't see, and that's in the cell wall. And those are called phospholipids, and that's where a lot of these interesting compounds live. So the lesson there is that you can't always tell that much about a steak by looking at it.